Welcome to the Green Lectionary Podcast, a production of Creation Justice Ministries. The Green Lectionary is a conversation on Scripture through the lens of creation justice. My name is Derek Weston, and today we will be looking at a text for the third Sunday in Lent. For this episode, I'm joined by Jerusha Neal, professor of homiletics at Duke Divinity School, and Doug Kaufmann, executive director of the Anabaptist Climate Collaborative. Before we begin our episode, a quick plug for one of Creation Justice Ministries' other programs, Blue Theology. Blue Theology is a place where current science and marine biology meets a theology of creation justice. Each summer, we host youth groups to engage in experiential learning, service projects, and contemplative practice with God's marine creation. We have outposts in North Carolina, Newport Beach, California, and Texas City, Texas, and registration is open now. To learn more, go to www.bluetheology.com. Join us now as we look at John chapter 2 through the lens of creation justice. Okay, our passage today, which is for the third week of Lent, comes from John chapter 2, verses 13 to 22. The Passover of the Jews was near, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. In the temple, he found people selling cattle, sheep, and doves, and the money changers seated at their tables. Making a whip of cords, he drove all of them out of the temple, both the sheep and the cattle. He also poured out the coins of the money changers and overturned their tables. He told those who were selling the doves, "Take these things out of here. Stop making my Father's house a marketplace." His disciples remembered that it was written, "Zeal for your house will consume me." The Jews then said to him, "What sign can you show us for doing this?" Jesus answered them, "Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up." The Jews then said, "This temple has been under construction for 46 years, and will you raise it up in 3 days?" But he was speaking of the temple of his body. After he was raised from the dead, his disciples remembered that he had said this, and they believed the scripture and the word that Jesus had spoken. So, friends, where is creation in this passage?
Well, first, I just wanted to thank you for including me in this conversation today, Derek. The thing that strikes me about creation in this passage is that John is making kind of a different point around creation than the synoptic gospels are. And so absolutely, there's all these animals in the text. But given the fact that John places this right at the start of the gospel, right after the first sign, that this is actually described as one of the signs of who Jesus is, I think for all of the really good work the synoptics do around justice questions, around monetizing creation, and the ways in which that has been folded into imperial structures. I mean, that whole question about the den of thieves in the synoptic gospels. I think John is making this huge point about the incarnation and about the word made flesh, about where we run into God in the world. So I can say more about that, but that's the voice that I'll bring to the podcast today, and I'll kind of flesh out what I mean by that. But Doug, I'm curious what you see. What do you see in this?
Well, I also saw that, I mean, for one thing, just that John spends a little more time on what creatures are there in the temple, like in the synoptics. It's the doves that are pigeons that are focused on, and here the cattle and sheep are part of the situation. And they're also those they're driven out, although probably for a different reason than the money changers. And as you say, that this commodification of those creatures is certainly part of what Jesus is talking about. So I was partly just intrigued that he pauses here a bit on that he describes the creatures that are not human a little bit more. And then I also did, thinking about the word made flesh, and it's flesh, right? It's not the word became human, it's That's flesh. Right. And so here, the other place where I see the creation is in speaking of the temple of his body, and who is the body of Christ. and are these, is the wider creation part of the body of Christ is going to be answering yes to that question, I guess, is part of what I'll be doing during this podcast that I think it is.
Yeah, and so Jerusha, I definitely want you to say more, because I think there was an obvious answer, and I think you both bypassed the obvious answer. And I love that you bypassed the obvious answer because I think it's a richer answer. So if we're thinking about creation as yes, there's the commodification that empire does of these creatures, these non-human creatures. But Jerusha, please say more about the creation showing up in the incarnation here.
Right. Well, one way, I mean, which I think would be a misreading of this story is, oh, well, animals don't belong in the temple. In when you look at the kind of you look at the synoptic version of this story, it does seem to be about kind of a protection of the house of God's purity. So, for example, in the synoptics, Jesus says, "My house is a house of prayer," quoting Isaiah, "and you've turned it into a den of robbers," alluding to Jeremiah, and then makes this separation, turns over the tables, sends out the money changers. And that's a really important word. I mean, absolutely. There's all kinds of ways in which empire can co-opt the house of God. And Jesus is sort of delineating that in the synoptics. I think something very different is happening here. And one of the clues of that is the scripture that Jesus quotes. So he doesn't quote Isaiah, doesn't quote Jeremiah. He actually alludes to Zechariah's description in Zechariah 14 of the day of the Lord. And there's this powerful, so first of all, Zechariah 14 is a really terrifying chapter. There's all this destruction, there's all this mayhem, there's plagues and death and all kinds of mess. But you get to the end, and Zechariah 14 says this, verses 20 through 21. It's describing the day of the Lord. And it says, "On that day there shall be inscribed on the bells of the horses, holy to the Lord. And the pots in the house of the Lord will be as holy as the bowls before the altar. And every pot in Jerusalem and Judah will be holy to the Lord of hosts." So there's this expansion of holiness, this sort of revelation that the holiness of God actually extends beyond the temple walls. So I really think this is a sign, almost like performance art. Jesus is almost enacting this sort of the sort of sign of the day of the Lord, the destruction that will come with this whip. But then this revelation that the holiness of God is actually present even beyond these temple walls. It's present through my body, through this sort of deep incarnation of my flesh that holds all of creation, right? That the holiness of God is actually present outside. So interestingly, when he scatters the money changers, overturns the temples, the tables, but it's the I think it's interesting. He drives out the sheep and the cattle almost in a sign of holiness spreading, like these holy, parts of creation are leaving. And my goodness, what a reframing of this passage. And then it makes more sense that this happens at the beginning of John's gospel and not at the end. Because in the synoptics, of course, this is one of the reasons Jesus is arrested. He
Right.
sort of, that leads to the passion. But in John, it's much more closely aligned. 1, 2, 3, 4. Who is Jesus? And what are the implications of this word made flesh? And part of it is the day of the Lord is here.
I love that. I love that. That is such a deeper reading of this passage and what's happening here that I've encountered, and I think but it totally, as you're saying it totally fits with the rest of the work that John is doing in the fourth gospel. It totally fits with the idea of the barrier of the temple coming down, and the glory of God kind of going out into all the world, and doing so through the flesh of Jesus in this really important way, which I think is pretty incredible. I have to
And
admit, like, I'm still
unexpected,
processing
right?
a little bit.
Yeah, no. I mean, but unexpected that the glory, um, that it's not where we expect to find the glory, right? This is the gospel where it's when Jesus is lifted up, right, that we see this glory. And there's these paradoxes all through John. Um, and I think this is setting up some of that. I think it is.
And that is, so I was asking this question to myself about the sheep and the cattle that would have, and the doves, they would have all been used for sacrifices. And so your image of thinking about the holiness spreading out from there, I was wondering, to what extent is Jesus critiquing the sacrifice of these animals? I didn't think so. I more was on the side of it's the commodification. I was trying to figure out, what the role of the mar, but this image of thinking about them going out, spreading the holiness of God. They likely will be sacrificed at some point for food, if nothing else.
As Jesus is sacrifice. I mean, there's this profound. I almost feel like, that first sign in John about the water turned to wine, and this sort of way in which that points eschatologically toward a wedding banquet that is on its way. In some ways, like, this is a powerful sort of early Christian meditation on eschatology, but it kind of needs deepening. It's very beautiful. Wedding banquet, absolutely lovely, abundance, beautiful. But right next to it, then you have this other picture of the day of the Lord. And there's cost to it. And there's an unexpected overturning of the world we know. And so I feel like there's something deeply cruciform in the way that this sign is placed right up against that wedding banquet sign. But both of them, I think, are meditations, early Christian meditations on eschatology and what will new creation look like, and what will it require?
Well, yeah. So this gets me into a reflection I had especially if you're going to talk about the cruciformity of these creatures. I connected this very quickly with the gospel of all creatures, which is a Anabaptist teaching from early in our tradition. It was dropped for a while and has come back in the last 30 years. And it's a reflection on Mark 16, the longer ending of Mark, where Jesus commands the disciples to preach the gospel to all creatures. And in the German, it can be gospel of all creatures as well. So that was the way that it was often interpreted. And it's also talked about in Colossians 1:23, the gospel that is preached to all creatures. And this sense of the and partly and this early Anabaptist was arguing against Martin Luther in a more objective view of the cross, that it's something that happened at one time and is complete. And he was arguing for more of an appropriation of the crucifixion, arguing for believers' baptism, and as part of that, sees the gospel, that the creatures actually proclaim the gospel in the sacrifice that they make for us, for our food, and that the members of Christ include all creatures. It's not just the church, which the Anabaptist tradition has more focused on that since that time, but it's there's a cruciformity that Christ is present with all creatures and is redeeming all creatures and turning their suffering into resurrected joy. This passage just, and the bringing together of the temple of his body, that he was raised from the dead, and that's connected here with these temple creatures. Brought that to mind for me.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Yeah.
Doug, I also was thinking of sort of secondary. This starts, it started bubbling up things in my brain, and nothing as ecclesially rooted as what you named, but it was a piece of poetry that came to me. And so there's a poet by the name of Nicole Brown, that Chuck Campbell actually turned me on to. And she's most well known for a book that she wrote, called To Those Who Were Our First Gods, which is a collection of poetry that came out about animals in 2018. And the poem that Chuck likes so much, I want to say this, is this beautiful poem in that collection called Against Despair. And it's a reflection on the death of a kid goat, and as a sort of metaphor for the suffering of the world and what hope looks like when it doesn't seem like anything one does makes a difference. And it's a powerful poem. But the poems that came up for me in relation to this passage was her next collection called The Donkey Elegies, where she takes the donkey and she does a series of poems that reflect on how this sort of butt of jokes, this seeming unimportant animal that just bears the burdens of humanity is holy. And of course, she has to come to the story of Palm Sunday, which interestingly is another time in John's gospel where Zechariah is quoted. So you have Zechariah kind of referenced here, and then your king will come riding on a donkey, also referenced at Palm Sunday. And she gives sort of the setting of Christ coming in on this donkey, the weight of it. And I'll just read the very end of this sort of reflection. It says, "Do you see the whites of that wild-eyed animal, the sclera lit by such fervor? Do you see how he pains to move through the mob? How easy for those young legs to buckle and slip, how precarious the procession of any chosen donkey." And as she goes on, you begin to see the Via Dolorosa. I mean, what you begin to see, as you described doctrinally so beautifully, is this witness in the donkey's body to the suffering of Jesus that is coming. It's a cruciform reading of that sort of triumphal entry, but from the animal's perspective. And so I just think there's something deep there in this connection between flesh and Jesus's proclamation that the temple is now my flesh, right? And what that calls us to. So less of a delineation between holy and unholy, as in the synoptics, and more an embrace of the holiness, the spreading holiness, the enfleshed holiness of God, revealed through Jesus in the world.
I feel like that segues beautifully to the next question, which is, where is God calling us to interact with creation? And there's some certain implications in that question if in fact holiness is enfleshed now. So where is God calling us to interact with creation in this passage?
Yeah, I do see it as this engagement that recognizes the holiness of all creatures and their being and their subjectivity, that they're not objects to be consumed. Although sometimes they are consumed, but they are beings that we are in relationship with and in communion with. And I think the other story that I'll tell a story I'll tell from my personal life is my baptismal experience as a pastor who baptizes people in the Elkhart River, which sometimes has too much manure in it for safe baptism. One of our practices is we would always then test the water before we baptize people, which included checking on all those creatures that live in the river bottom. And there's a whole host of these insects and a few other worms and different things, snails, but also these insects that spend their adolescence in the river bottom and then fly away in adulthood, which to me is just a marvelous life. To have those two stages of life. And I got to know especially the caddisfly larva, which, because it builds a little house around itself, of sticks and stones. And I think that's why it is the first time I started to realize, as I was doing this 20 years ago, that these creatures were my neighbors. And eventually to come to realize, well, and these creatures also participate in our baptismal practice and are witnesses to the baptism that goes on. And um, we don't have a strong holy water kind of idea, but then in a sense, I'm trying to strengthen that and to realize that by baptizing in the Elkhart River, that it's recognizing the holiness of that place. And it was one time when I was preaching in Toronto that I realized too that some of those creatures and that some of that water was flowing past us on Lake Ontario, because we're all connected in the Great Lakes watershed, which is a wonderful watershed to be part of. I might just put in a little shameless plug for us. Yeah, the sense of the holiness of all creation, I think, does need to lead. It doesn't have to. It doesn't always happen, but I think it ought to lead to a respect and a practice of how we relate to other creatures, where we take account of how our actions affect them. When we're making decisions about development and planning and that kind of stuff, and thinking about endangered species or loss of habitat, I think we need to take account of its effect on all creation.
The word that comes to me as I listen to you, Doug, is George Zachariah, in his article or his chapter in Decolonized Ecology, I think is the book, talks about the thingification of the world. And what would it mean to stop seeing creation as a thing, to see it held, embraced, co-witnesses, right? Co-participants in this body that holds us, the body of Jesus. What would that mean? And I think that's the deep call of this passage. Is your question, Derek, was how does God call us to interact with creation? And I think the first thing this passage does is a reorientation toward relationship, rather than a thingification.
Yeah, because I think, the thing that you both have drawn my attention to is that Jesus isn't actually against the sacrificial role of the animals here. That's part of the relationship. That's part of the relationship that God has created for humans and creation to be in. It's the thingification. It's that they become a thing. It's that they become another thing that can be bought and sold. That they can be another thing that is part of the marketplace, another thing that's part of the economy. Not God's economy, the economy, right? And when they become part of the economy, the relationship part is broken down. When they're a part of our connection to God and to our community, there's the reinforcement of bonds. There's the reinforcement of we belong to creation and creation belongs to us, and we're a part of creation and we're in and amongst creation. But when they become part of this thing that's in the marketplace, particularly in this space, then they're just another off the assembly line kind of thing. Um, and more than anything, maybe we're being asked to break ourselves out of that creation as something to be bought and sold. Creation as something to be mass produced. Creation as something to be to put a price tag on.
Well, I just wanted to also make sure that I credited Tom Berry. It would be the inspiration for my comments around and who says that we must come to see the world not as a collection of objects, but as a communion of subjects. So that's been a phrase for me that's been key thinking about this. And I just wanted to add that as you talk about this, I've often thought about the word natural resources, Department of Natural Resources, and the idea of nature as a resource and the thingification that goes with that. But it starts to creep up because personnel directors might be the human resources directors. And so there's even, I mean, I think it starts to go up, and the thingification, I mean, slavery is the thingification of other humans, and or human resources is the thingification of labor, rather than seeing it as something that's a part of ourselves and who we are, and it comes out of our being. It's separated from us, and it's something that can be bought and sold. So
yes, the thing that came from me, Derek, as I was listening, and Doug, you as well, I feel like there's two sort of streams that are deeply related in this passage, and one has to do, again, which we've been talking about, our relationship to creation, the relationality of creation. But there is like this corollary, that is this question of holiness and God's presence. And is holiness and God's presence somehow set apart and segregated and set off from the mundane and from ordinary life? Or is there permeability? And this passage gives such an interesting answer to that, because Jesus doesn't just dissolve the particularity of holiness. He does locate it somewhere. He says, located in my body, right? That's where I'm locating it. But because we've already read John 1 about all of flesh being who Jesus is, there is a way in which, in that particularity, there is also this sacralization again of the world, because Jesus is holding it in his heart, in his actual body, his enfleshed being. And so I feel like there's these two deep theological, one about anthropology, right? The fact that we are connected in relation, what it means to be a creature. And then this deep, deep, beautiful affirmation of God's presence in the world, on the loose, as it were. Yeah.
I love that. And particularly as, connecting that to the idea of these animals running free, which, by the way, I've never even really thought about that in this passage, that Jesus releases these animals out into the streets. It's kind of this chaotic image of these animals that are suddenly let loose, and which also I feel like connects to a lot of John's understanding of the Holy Spirit. That there's this
doves flying everywhere.
It's gonna go where it will, and good luck trying to predict the next movement here.
Lovely.
But it is, and it's reminding us, and thinking about this, in my mind, I'm actually kind of connecting the dots, because last week we were talking about the Transfiguration and thinking about the experience of the holy there, that the disciples kind of want to bask in and isolate in one place, and Jesus saying, no, it's time to go back down the mountain. It's time to go back and find the holy out in the world. And I think this is another place of the holy being released out into the world, and being reminded that the holy is out there, and that this temple is only as useful as our ability to perceive the holy in it. And we need to develop the sensibility to experience the holy beyond the walls of this temple, particularly in the context of a world where that temple has been destroyed.
Yes.
So I think we've tiptoed around it a little bit. But where is there now a call to action for the church and for us as people of faith, based off of the things that we've said about where creation is and how we're called to interact with creation?
So I'll just dive in with one idea. More so than the synoptic gospels, I think, particularly because the connection with sign, John's version of this story is about discernment. It is about discerning the holy in the world and who this Jesus is and what this Jesus is calling us to. Part of the reason I note that is all of the times in this passage where it talks about the disciples reflecting later, like it happens several times where the disciples are like, and they didn't really get it at the time, but then they were thinking back and they remembered this verse. This verse, by the way, zeal for your father's house, or zeal for your house will consume me, is in that same psalm that talks about gall and vinegar given. I mean, it's the psalm that is actually the psalm that so often is our reference point for Jesus on the cross. And so here they are reflecting on this psalm and Jesus's words, and all of a sudden this sign makes sense. And what seemed impossible when Jesus said it, the destruction and the raising, all of a sudden you have eyes to see. And so I feel like on top of everything else, this passage is about what does it mean as a church to discern the signs of the times that we're in, to discern the destructions that are happening now, and to recognize the holiness at work in the world and respond. That doesn't sound like particularly like active. I know we're to the takeaway part of the podcast, but I think part of what John is telling us in this passage, and certainly this is work for Lent, is that we've lost the ability to see the depth of the destruction, and even perhaps the craziness of the hope, right? That I mean, Jesus says this thing at the end, I will be raised in 3 days. And we say, how is this possible? It can't be possible. And what kind of redefinition of the world would we have to lean into? A relearning of what hope looks like, a relearning of a hope that goes through Good Friday, rather than evades it. I mean, I feel like that's really where this passage is pressing the church in relation to ecology. To be concrete, I think we're to a point where small fixes are not going to save the world that we love and know, and there's a fundamental paradigm shift that we are going through as a church to begin to really recognize, what does it mean to say that God holds this world in God's hands? And listeners at home can't see me, but I'm holding up my hands, actually in my flesh, in my body. What does that mean? And I think those are the deep questions that John 2 presses us to.
Your question brings me to what is the main action in this passage, and we haven't talked about this yet. So this is the fact that Jesus makes a whip of cords and drove them out of the temple. And that's something that I've also been reflecting on as a committed pacifist, and my tradition and my own pacifism is based on it being rooted in the life and practice and teachings of Jesus.
Hmm.
So what does it mean if Jesus, this is one of the passages that is sometimes used in saying that Jesus wasn't committed to pacifism.
Hmm.
And so I think about how it is a very active engagement. I mean, it's a disturbance. It's like it's rowdy in a way. I don't think of it as violent in the sense of it doesn't appear to be that people were injured or that kind of, we don't know for sure. I mean, it doesn't tell us otherwise. But it shows Jesus engaging in an act of what we might call nonviolent resistance. And I think about that in terms of the church's call to point out what we're doing to the earth and the ways that we are destroying the planet, but to demonstrate, not just to talk about, or not just to say it, but to demonstrate it in our bodies, that this ought not to continue.
Thank you for bringing up the whip, because it's hard for me too. I keep playing with this idea of the interplay between this passage and Zechariah 14, which also reveals a God that is, there's all kinds of devastation and destruction. It's a hard passage, right? It's not an easy one. But one of the things that strikes me about that passage is the scourge in that passage in Zechariah 14 is meant to reveal the connection of the world and the holiness of creation. Like there's something about the grief that the day of the Lord describes in Zechariah 14 that is meant to open our eyes to break this thingification that says actually you are far more connected than you think. And when I look at Jesus with that whip in the temple, there's a similar kind of threshing and a kind of we are more connected than you think. And and my reading of that is so, again, because of its placement in John, I lean into the discernment of that as a sign. But Doug, I think you're really right to push us to, are there ways that we are called into prophetic sign acts? Are there ways that we are called into a kind of uncovering of the connectedness of suffering and holiness, the braided together quality of those things in the world, born together because we are part of a body. So I'm really grateful for that insight. Thank you.
Couple thoughts come to mind. I think there's something about the disciples' response here that makes you think this is what happens when you see your very mellow friend totally freak out. And you're like, oh, wow, this is something we haven't seen before of this person. We've mostly just seen him kind of walking and talking and turning water into wine. We haven't actually seen him like, this is what he looks like when he's angry. We haven't seen this before. And I wonder, like, I feel like the world hasn't seen the church righteously angry. Doesn't see the church righteously angry. They see us angry about really dumb things in sort of culture war kind of ways, but they don't see us angry about injustice. They don't see us angry about the devastation of our ecology. They don't see us angry about these things that really matter. And maybe there's a call here to the expressions of that kind of righteous anger. The other thing that comes to my mind is, thinking about the fact that, Jerusha, as you've pointed out several times, that in the Synoptic Gospels, this happens at the end. This is kind of the last straw, and we're done with this Jesus. And in John's Gospel, it happens at the beginning, and there's almost this question of, did he do this every Passover? It was like, did they get to the point where they're like, oh, here we go again. We're gonna have to go through this thing. We're gonna get kicked out of the temple again. But again, I bring that up, one, because it's a funny image for me, but also because I also kind of love the image of Jesus doing this every Passover, for the course of his ministry, of like the consistency of, I'm going to disrupt this thing again because it needs to be disrupted. And like the fact that sometimes we show up for a thing once, we protest a thing once, we boycott a thing once, and the need to come back, the need to bring that same energy over and over and over again. And in that, I hear a call to action for the church to show up with this energy over and over again.
And this is just a quip, but I imagine the temple authorities and Roman officials then having to come up with their Jesus plan. Like, what are we gonna do about Jesus?
What if that guy shows up again? Yeah.
Is there a poster or something?
Right. So Chuck's favorite line in that poem I mentioned, Against Despair, the kid goat, is after the goat is dead, after they try to keep the goat alive all night and the goat dies. Interestingly, the goat is described as having a whip-like body. That struck me just because of the passage we're reading. But the final word is hope is not a thing you feel, but something you do. And part of the goal of that poem is to say that it matters. Action matters, even when it looks like it doesn't, even when the goat is now dead on your floor. The feeding of a beast matters. And so the consistency of that, and I don't think you sustain that kind of consistency, because there's a way in which even that sort of intervention can become thingified, or the result becomes thingified. I'm going to do this to get this effect, right? And it can again, it oddly can remove the relationality too, so that to have this sense of, I show up because this is worth doing. This is worth saying about what the world is, who I am, who the God I worship is. Like, it's worth saying today, it's worth saying tomorrow, it's worth saying next season, like, regardless. And I think that's profound. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, thank you both. This has been such a profound conversation. I absolutely appreciate your insights on this. And gosh, I mean, I think I've always found so much inspiration in this text, but I feel like I'm looking at it through completely new eyes. So, Jerusha, Doug, thank you so much for being with us today, and for all of your wisdom and reflection on this passage.
Thank you,
Derek. Yeah.
Thank you for joining us for the Green Lectionary Podcast. This episode was produced by Derek Weston, and the music was provided by Christian McIver. Please like and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, and help us spread the word with a good review. Leave us a comment to let us know how you've used the show and how we can make it more useful for your ministry. You can learn more about this and other programs of Creation Justice Ministries at creationjustice.org.
Our story comes alive within these pages, for every time and place throughout the ages. God speaks and is heard, and the enduring word calls us to care for our world as we share the love that can set creation free. Restoring the earth to wholeness, peace, and harmony. Let the songs of the water, land, and sky resound, 'cause together we're all bound within these pages. There's always new life to be found.